Hello, I'm Dominic Laurie, and welcome to this latest episode of Global Thinking, the podcast from Kekst CNC. The COVID-19 pandemic has made remote working the norm for so many people, so much so that in future we'll likely see more flexibility on where employees work from and how an organisation operates. Home working may remain widespread, and in the office, core working hours may shift to ensure social distancing. Now, some businesses may also look to decentralize and spread their workforce across multiple locations. While the pandemic has tested issues management teams, the challenge is now to look at other impacts on other risk factors. Now, one of the greatest of those being how remote working impacts cybersecurity and what organizations can do to mitigate this risk. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And joining us to do so are David Emm, Principal Security Researcher at Kaspersky Labs, Hans Allnut, partner at DAC Beachcroft LLP, where he leads their award-winning cyber risk and breach response team, Raf Sanchez, International Breach Response Manager at Beazley, the international insurers, and Ben Curson, who's a partner at Kekst CNC, who specializes in crisis and cyber, and often where the two meet. Welcome, all of you. A general question for all of you to start with: how will this new remote and home and dispersed working environment change the nature of cybersecurity and the risks surrounding it? David, I'll start with you.
I think we're in the middle of a huge change. Obviously, we've got a sort of perfect storm going on here because lots of us forced to work from home. At the same time, of course, we've got cyber criminals out there and other targeted attackers as well, exploiting the whole topic of COVID-19, which of course everybody is interested in. So we've got this potential weakness of people working from home who don't necessarily have the same infrastructure that they have within the office, and therefore potentially vulnerable to attack. So we've got that all going on. And of course, we've got a situation where for many companies, particularly small and medium-sized businesses, they've really just been scrabbling to ensure business continuity. And obviously cybersecurity, not necessarily toppermost in their minds. What I think will happen as we move forward, of course, is this will become part of the pattern of our working. And my hope certainly would be there that cybersecurity becomes part of what's inbuilt into that strategy for dealing with that.
So Hans Allnut, same question to you.
From my perspective, we're already seeing some immediate trends on breach and cyber incidents, and that may play out in the medium to long term. It's interesting when you look at some of the attacks we've seen recently. Some of them are specifically COVID related, playing on employees' goodwill, that sense of in it all together. So to give an example of that, we've seen phishing campaigns and email campaigns where the attackers are trying to get money transferred to different bank accounts. And they've said things like, our Indian bank has now changed because of the COVID crisis. Please, can you transfer it into this bank account? And of course, everyone, again, in the current crisis is trying to be helpful. So we'll cut corners, not follow their internal procedures and say, yeah, absolutely, we're here to help you. And then lo and behold, they transfer the money to the wrong bank account. We've also seen within the organization similar processes of trying to help in a moment of crisis. So employees using new software platforms or a colleague's software platform that they might not be trained up on in order to ensure that there is business continuity and things are still being done, but then using that software platform incorrectly and then causing a data breach. We've had, for example, marketing software platforms being misused and transmitting communications to the wrong people.
Raf Sanchez from Beazley, I guess you've got hands out highlighted two ingredients which do create a perfect storm, don't they, for potential cyber criminals. You have a changing environment where people suddenly don't know the rules, and you've also got an environment where people are afraid. I mean, that seems a rich pickings, doesn't it?
You've all hit the nail on the head so far, and I think the one word that everyone has used is change. This is a rapid and involuntary change for many people and many organizations. And, as an example, I've had the same haircut for the last 20 years. There are certain things that I don't want to change, and working practices and approaches to security are some of those those things. And yes, there are opportunistic attacks now taking advantage of that inability to rapidly shift from one set of working practices to another.
I think so, Dom. Yeah, and picking up on what Han said, there's a lot more opportunity for individuals, I guess, within companies to make mistakes which possibly they wouldn't do if they were in the office. Hans highlighted a few, but phishing attacks. I've seen a few where they purport emails purporting to be from HR departments saying, click on this and log in so you can get our new policies, or click on this link if you want to see to get access to some COVID testing kits or things like that. So there's new opportunities for people, particularly when it comes to phishing. And I think from a comms perspective, although the response may not, if a company is breached, the response may not be particularly different in terms of how it was 4 months ago. I would certainly think that the preparation needs to be a bit different, because it's much more difficult to internally communicate in the way that you would do if you're in the same place, and possibly the playbooks and crisis manuals that companies have, especially as David said, the smaller and medium-sized ones, they probably need updating to make sure that people can react appropriately when they're all not in the same place.
David Emm from Kaspersky Labs. David, one thing that I find very interesting about working by myself at home, as I have done for a few months, and this is the same for lots of people, is we've all had to invent our own workarounds. We're all our own IT department. We're using tools that perhaps, let's face it, fall outside the normal secure systems of an office. That must create problems.
Undoubtedly it does. I mentioned earlier, that for many companies, this really represented a scramble really for business continuity. Their key thing was, can we keep going? Can we operate? And if that meant sending people off to the store before lockdown to grab a laptop or use the one that they're using at home, which isn't a work one, then so be it for many companies. A couple of months ago, we did a survey at Kaspersky of people, this was global, just to find out how people were coping. And it was interesting that 50% of the companies that we spoke to said they had no policy for regulating work from home devices. And about 3/4 of them said that they had no additional security awareness program going on. And therefore, in that sense, there's no steer for people at the sharp end having to work. And obviously nobody on hand from IT there to kind of guide them and help them along.
Let's flip it and look positively forward. What can companies do? So they have a workforce that likes working, say, 2-3 days a week at least from home or another remote location. They like the freedom that gives them. What can a company do to allow that workforce to work more securely?
I think that's the right way to think about it, Dominic. This is an opportunity for companies. This is an opportunity for companies to effectively use an unscheduled change, a massive sea change in working practices to improve their cybersecurity.
When people are working from some public Wi-Fi spot and they're out of sight, out of mind, how do you do that? You talked about the positive carrot of flexibility, Raf, but how do you then introduce systems that even improve security versus what it was before? Do those solutions exist yet?
Companies or organizations generally are doing enough to educate people about the risk, because I'm not convinced that there's a lot of internal communications, for example, going on, or employee communications, especially remotely, where people are actually aware of some of the things that we've been talking about already this morning.
Yeah, I think those are both great points. To Dominic's point, training, awareness, and getting staff members on side is much cheaper than dealing with an incident, and much cheaper than spending your entire IT budget on various pieces of software and boxes in your server rooms that make blinking lights.
What is a good news story is that I think there will be a shift from organizations to actually office working, local working will be the exception. And if you're building new IT platforms, if you're rolling out new IT security, everything will be mobile first, remote first. So therefore you design your systems, you roll things out with the fact that everything will be remote.
How does this new remote decentralized environment make that a harder task to overcome? Because that's difficult enough when everyone's in a war room in some headquarters somewhere off a dual carriageway. But if there are 50 people in 50 different places, surely I would have thought that becomes even more difficult.
There is definitely a difference between an online Zoom meeting and people sat around a table. And you can see that day in, day out, people are less vocal, less interactive, and typically might have be doing two things at once. So there is a downside to it. But I think generally speaking, on crisis, people are responding in different locations. So it's not a huge difference to the actual mechanism of a crisis.
I think that's a good point, Hans, because I think you do have to be able to be flexible, and you do have to now plan for people to be, joining remotely, able to only participate via audio. They may be multitasking. I'm making a pavlova as we're doing this podcast. So, you have to be able to have those skills, in the new environment.
I know, Ben, that we've been working at Kekst CNC on a remote version of our crisis simulation, the Situation Room. And how has that changed the ability to prepare for a crisis?
Yeah, I think we have to prepare. I mean, there's a lot of talk about the new normal, probably more talk than there should be about it. But I think people being remote, is a fact that we're all going to face, as the rest of the team have said, and I think having this remote capability for practicing remotely is important. I mean, we used to, as you know, Dom, we used to do a lot of tabletop exercises, have people all in the same room. But there's a school of thought which is completely fair enough, and I think has been borne out over the last 4 months, that actually in reality, even before this crisis, senior people in organisations were not always in the same place.
Do you think that a remote decentralised workforce possibly could have a greater potential to speak up and blow the whistle if they're not intimidated by the senior voice in the room as they might have been before?
I think that has a lot to do with the culture of the particular organisation. It's certainly a positive thing. I mean, one thing certainly that I think is always potentially dangerous is where you have draconian policies which run the risk of driving under the table, things that go wrong. And actually what you want is people to say, this has happened, without thinking, well, there's going to be a disciplinary here. Culture has a big thing to do with that. We're not looking for a change in how you do this or that necessarily. We're looking actually for a mindset which thinks about potential danger in the same way that we try and teach our children to cross the road or not walk off with strangers.
Hans Allnut at DAC Beachcroft, what would you say, what would your advice to companies, your clients, be to do now that they weren't doing before?
The greatest thing that's going to come out in the medium to long term is a lot of security vulnerabilities based on rapidly acquired software or workarounds or things that have been put in place. So I think companies should be looking at their sort of a health check on what they've put in place from a technical perspective over the last 4 months, and ensuring that any vulnerabilities or the bits that they didn't do 3 months ago to get the software in is addressed.
Ben Curson from Kekst CNC, what would you say are one or two communications points that companies, clients should be implementing, putting into action, just even thinking about that they weren't a few months ago?
I think making sure that you're prepared for the new situation you're likely to find yourself in is very important. However you are able to do that. And I think the other thing, which is picking up on what David said, is this culture point is a very important one. I think practically for me, it would be probably thinking about your employee engagement and making sure that as best as possible, your employees are aware of the risks that remote working can provide.
Raf Sanchez at Beazley, what one or two things would you ask companies to do, advise them to do?
I would advise them to understand that this change is permanent now, that the old working practices are no longer viable. And as Ben has said, engage with their staff and help them to understand what is expected of them, but how this can actually help them. There are positives, as we said, about previously inflexible working practices and environments. So for me, it's adapt to this change. Don't try and fight it, and in that way, you will ensure that you are head of the pack amongst your peers.
Thank you very much, everyone. David Emm from Kaspersky Labs, Hans Allnut from DAC Beachcroft, Raf Sanchez at Beazley, who was making a pavlova as he was speaking to us, which is multitasking. I'm not sure how good or bad that is for cybersecurity. And Ben Curson, partner at Kekst CNC. Thank you very much. And do visit our website, kekscnc.com, for all the other episodes of our podcast series, Global Thinking.